Well, in the most recent of these Foundations videos, we considered what it meant for Jesus to announce the coming of the kingdom, and how he came to undo everything which had gone wrong. But ultimately, at the heart of what has gone wrong in our world is human sin. About 100 years ago, the Daily News, a newspaper, published an essay by the Christian author G.K. Chesterton about what is wrong with the world. Chesterton wrote this: "The answer to the question, what is wrong, is, or should be, I am wrong." In Jesus' day, people were perhaps more conscious of sin than they are today. They prayed psalms of confession, they sacrificed lambs as a sign of God's punishment for wrongdoing, they celebrated festivals like the Day of Atonement. But despite that, many in first century Israel saw the world in quite binary terms. There were the righteous people who kept God's laws, and then there were the sinners, the people who were particularly bad, like the prostitutes or the tax collectors or Gentiles like the Romans. One group was pure, the other was dirty and unclean. One group was respected, the other looked down upon. One was right with God, the other to be cast out. Jesus did not see the world in those terms. He told a story once of a Pharisee and a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get." But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." Jesus said it was not the Pharisee who went away justified, but the tax collector who knew his sin and repented. Everyone was a sinner and in need of God's mercy. Those were radical ideas at the time. In Luke, we read about a time when Jesus dined at the house of a Pharisee called Simon, and a woman who had lived a sinful life, which probably means she had been a prostitute, entered and wept at his feet and anointed them with perfume. The Pharisee was outraged. If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. But Jesus challenged the Pharisee for his own hard heart and said to the woman, "Your sins are forgiven. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." On another occasion, he told a story about a man who had two sons, in which the father represents God. The younger son had asked for his share of the inheritance early, a shocking thing in that culture, in which he was essentially saying that he wished his father was dead. He squandered the money in a far-off country on wild living, and at this point the Pharisees would have been cheering along because he had received his comeuppance. But then the story changes. The son turns towards home and returns to the father. And the father sees him from far away and runs to meet him and hugs him and kisses him and welcomes him back as his son. And he throws him a party with the best calf on the menu to celebrate his return. And at this point, the Pharisees would have been shocked. Jesus was saying that no one was beyond the reach of God's mercy. But then Jesus takes the story further. Yes, no one was so bad that they were beyond the reach of God's mercy, but there was no one so good that they did not need it either. The father had had two sons. The older son, who had kept the rules, resented the younger son being welcomed home and would not go into the party, even when the father pleaded with him. He showed that actually he wasn't so different from the younger son after all. He complains about never being given a goat for a get-together with his friends. He too cared for his possessions more than the relationship with his father. And Jesus leaves it as an open question as to whether the older son, the one who kept all the rules, ever came in. It was a challenge to the Pharisees. Were they willing to welcome tax collectors and sinners into God's kingdom? Did they realize they needed God's grace too? Jesus showed that they too were sinners. They couldn't keep God's perfect standards either. They kept to rituals and traditions, but they were missing what God was really like. They cared more about keeping rules on the Sabbath than about healing the sick, more about fasting than about people going hungry. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, Jesus said. Justice, mercy, and faithfulness. They too needed God's grace, even if they didn't realize it. Tim Keller describes the message of Jesus like this: we are more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe. Yet at the very same time, we are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope. But how could sinners be made right with a holy God? When Jesus' disciples had identified that he was the Messiah, he began to tell them all the things that must happen to him. One day he would suffer and die at the hands of the authorities, and then he would rise again to life. We read about a turning point in Jesus' ministry in Luke 9:51. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. His final earthly journey to the cross had begun. And next time, we'll think about what that meant.